There is a photograph from January 1932. 6 sisters, daughters of a baron, arranged in a row for the Sketch magazine. Golden hair, pearls, the composed half-smiles of women bred to be decorative. One nursery produced all 6 of them, but that nursery also produced a fascist who married in the drawing room of Joseph Goebbels with Hitler as guest of honor. A communist who refused rescue from a British destroyer sent by her own father. A woman who put a pistol to her head in a Munich park the day her country declared war. And a duchess who turned a bankrupt estate into a £910 million fortune. Same parents, same governess, same linen cupboard under the stairs. 6 completely different answers to the same impossible question. What does a woman do when the only script she is handed is one she cannot bear to read? Chapter 1. 6 girls, 1 cupboard, and no school. The linen cupboard under the stairs at Swinbrook House was barely large enough for 2 children, but all 6 Mitford sisters claimed it as their parliament. They called it the Hons Cupboard. The name came from their private society, the Society of Hons, which existed for the sole purpose of excluding everyone who was not them. To enter, you knocked. A voice from the dark asked whether you were a Hon or a counter-Hon. If you answered wrong, the door stayed shut. It was a game. It was also a rehearsal. Because the world outside that cupboard had already decided what these girls would become, and the cupboard was the only place where they got to decide for themselves. The house was Swinbrook, in the Oxfordshire Cotswolds. Their father was David Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Redesdale. Their mother was Sidney Bowles, daughter of a magazine editor, a woman of striking beauty and eccentric conviction. She believed that the skull was porous, that fresh air could enter the brain through the bone, that germs were essentially fictional, that children who were exposed to the full force of nature would grow stronger than children who were coddled. The Mitford children were not coddled. There were 7 of them in the end, 6 girls and 1 boy. Nancy came first in 1904, then Pamela in 1907, Tom in 1909, Diana in 1910, Unity in 1914, Jessica in 1917, and Deborah, the baby, in 1920. The boy Tom was sent to Eton. The girls were sent nowhere. This was not poverty. This was policy. The British aristocratic system in the early 20th century operated on a simple premise when it came to daughters. They did not need to be educated. They needed to be presentable. Lord Redesdale believed that educating girls was not merely unnecessary, but actively dangerous. An educated woman was an argumentative woman. An argumentative woman was an unmarriageable woman, and an unmarriageable woman was a failure. So the Mitford girls were taught at home, by governesses. The governesses came and went with such regularity that the children named them like weather systems. There was the one who was lazy, the one who was strange, the one who cried. Nancy, the eldest and the sharpest, later estimated that she received the equivalent of no formal education whatsoever. She taught herself to read from the family library. She read everything she could reach. They all did. That library became their university, their escape hatch, their ammunition depot. Nancy consumed novels and developed a tongue so sharp it drew blood at the dinner table. Jessica found political texts and began building an ideology of rage. Unity found Germany and never came back. But before all of that, there was the cupboard. And there was the cold. And there were the games. The Mitford childhood was wild in the way that only isolated, under-supervised aristocratic childhoods could be. They kept pets obsessively. Jessica had a sheep called Miranda. Unity had a rat called Ratular. Deborah had a pony and talked to it more than she talked to most humans. They invented languages. They tortured each other in the way that siblings do. except that 6 sisters in close confinement made the cruelty both inventive and relentless. Nancy, the eldest, was the chief tormentor. She told the younger ones they were adopted. She told Deborah that she had been purchased from a shop and could be returned. It sounds charming when it is written down. The Mitfords themselves later made it sound charming. That was their great trick. They could describe almost anything, no matter how painful, in a voice that made you laugh. But underneath the laughter was a system. Lord Redesdale's world was governed by boundaries that were invisible to him because he had never needed to see them. His daughters could not attend school, could not attend university, could not train for a profession, could not manage money, could not travel alone without scandal. The only future the system offered them was marriage, and the only preparation it gave them was beauty, manners, and the ability to remain silent at the right moments. 6 daughters. 6 brilliant, furious, bored, ambitious, original minds. And the system looked at all 6 of them and saw 6 future wives. The cupboard under the stairs was the only parliament they had, and what they were debating, though none of them knew it yet, was how to survive a world that had already decided they did not need to think. What happened when they left that cupboard would define the 20th century's understanding of what privilege does to women. But first, the machine had to process them. Chapter 2. The Machine That Made Debutantes. The London season of 1928 processed young women like a factory line, and the product it manufactured was a wife. The season ran from April to July. It had operated with interruptions for wars since the 18th century. By the 1920s, it was the most efficient mechanism the British upper classes possessed for sorting, displaying, and distributing their daughters. The process began with presentation at court. A young woman, aged 17 or 18, dressed in white with 3 ostrich feathers in her hair, was driven to Buckingham Palace. She entered the throne room. She curtsied to the King and Queen, and from that moment, she was officially on the market. What followed was a season of balls, garden parties, dinners, and country house weekends that functioned with the precision of an industrial operation. A girl's mother, or a sponsor if the mother was unsuitable, managed the campaign. Invitations were secured. Dresses were commissioned. A girl was seen at the right events, introduced to the right families, photographed with the right people. The criteria for success were simple and explicit: bloodline, beauty, compliance. The system did not ask what a girl thought. It did not ask what she wanted. It asked whether she could dance, whether she could make conversation without expressing an opinion, and whether her father's title was sufficient to attract offers. Nancy Mitford entered this machine first. She was presented at court in 1923, at 19 years old. She was witty, angular, not conventionally beautiful, and already dangerous. She had spent years in the library at Swimbrook, sharpening a mind that the season had no use for. She danced. She attended the balls. She watched. And she began taking notes because Nancy understood before any of her sisters that the absurdity of the system was material. Material for comedy, material for revenge. But the system's true showcase was Diana. Diana Mitford was, by the universal consensus of everyone who ever saw her, one of the most beautiful women in England. She had cobalt blue eyes, golden hair, a profile that painters requested and photographers chased. When she entered a room, people stopped talking. This was not family mythology. This was documented, reported, and repeated across decades by people who had no reason to exaggerate. The machine loved Diana. Diana was exactly what the machine was designed to produce. Beautiful, well-bred, the daughter of a baron. And in 1929, at 19 years old, Diana married Brian Guinness, heir to one of the largest fortunes in the British Isles. The wedding was the society event of the year. 11 bridesmaids, coverage in every major newspaper and magazine. The guest list included Evelyn Waugh, Augustus John, Lytton Strachey, and half the aristocracy of England. Diana wore a dress of ivory and gold. She was radiant. She was perfect. She was the system's finest product. And here is the image against the reality. Because the machine that produced Diana's wedding also produced a woman who was ferociously intelligent, deeply restless, and profoundly bored by everything the system had told her to want. Brian Guinness was kind, wealthy, cultured, and utterly unable to contain her. Within 3 years, Diana would leave him. She would leave the fortune. She would leave the 11 bridesmaids and the ivory dress and the society pages. She would leave it all for a fascist, but in 1929, none of that was visible. The photographs showed a beautiful bride. The gossip columns celebrated a perfect match. The machine had done its work and the product looked flawless. Behind Diana, the other sisters were queuing. Pamela, quiet, practical, and already invisible to the society pages. Unity, large, strange, intense, already difficult. Jessica, furious, political, counting the days until she could escape. Deborah, still a child, not yet aware of what awaited her. The machine processed them all. It assessed their bloodline. It evaluated their beauty. It measured their willingness to comply. And it found in every case except Diana that the product was defective. These girls would not be silent. They would not be decorative. They would not accept the script. But the machine did not care about defects. The machine only cared about display. And by 1932, the Mitford family had become the most displayed family in England. Chapter 3. The photograph that sold a family. By 1932, newspaper editors understood something simple about the Mitford sisters. They sold papers, and they would never stop. The photograph appeared in the Sketch in January of that year. 6 sisters, arranged in descending order, each one turned slightly toward the camera. The lighting was soft. The pearls were real. The smiles were calibrated to suggest warmth without vulnerability. It was the kind of photograph that the British society press had perfected over decades. The aristocratic family as aesthetic object, arranged for consumption. But this photograph was different, because these were not ordinary aristocratic daughters. These were the Mitfords. And by 1932, the Mitfords had become something the press could not resist. A family that was simultaneously glamorous, scandalous, and reliably unpredictable. Nancy had published her first novel. Diana was already the most photographed woman in English society. Unity was growing into something strange and unsettling that the gossip columns had not yet learned to categorize. Jessica was developing opinions that would have horrified the readers of The Tatler. Pamela was keeping chickens, and Deborah, at 12, was already displaying the practical competence that would one day save a dukedom. The press construction of the Mitford family was a masterwork of selective vision. The Daily Express loved them. The Daily Mirror tracked them. The Tatler featured them. The Sketch photographed them. The Bystander reported on their parties. They appeared in at least 5 major society publications with the regularity of weather reports. The coverage followed a formula. Beautiful sisters, eccentric father, glamorous mother, and an endless supply of quotable incidents that made the English upper classes look both magnificent and delightfully mad. What the coverage did not mention was the infrastructure beneath the image. Lord Redesdale's finances were precarious. The Swinbrook house had been built to his specifications and was, by most accounts, charmless. The marriage between their parents was already under pressure from temperamental differences that would, within a decade, become ideological chasms. Nancy's wit was fueled by genuine unhappiness, Diana's beauty was a passport she was already preparing to use for purposes the gossip columns could not have imagined. The scale of the public image was remarkable for a family that held only a barony. 6 sisters, 1 nursery, appearances across at least 5 major society magazines, 1 society wedding described as the event of the year, a family name that had become shorthand for aristocratic spectacle, and a father whose explosive temper and hatred of foreigners was treated as colourful eccentricity rather than the warning sign it actually was. This is what the aristocratic system did best. It manufactured an image. It polished it. It distributed it through every available channel of press and society. And it ensured that the image was so beautiful, so compelling, so perfectly arranged that no one looked behind it. Because behind the photograph, the fractures had already begun. Diana had met Oswald Mosley. The encounter had taken place at a dinner party, and the effect was immediate and total. She was captivated, not merely attracted, but ideologically and physically consumed by a man who would lead the largest fascist movement in British history. Within months of that sketch photograph, Diana would begin dismantling the life the machine had built for her. Unity had begun learning German. Her obsession was not yet focused, but the trajectory was already visible. She was large, loud, and drawn to extremity the way certain temperaments are drawn to fire. She did not want to be decorative. She wanted to be significant. And the century she was living in offered one very specific route to significance for a young woman with an aristocratic name and no education: proximity to power. Jessica, at 15, had already opened what she later called her running away fund. She was saving money, coin by coin, in a secret account. She knew she was going to leave. She did not yet know where. But she knew that the photograph, the pearls, the composed half smiles, the entire apparatus of aristocratic display was a lie, and she was going to refuse it. In January 1932, none of this was visible. The photograph showed 6 beautiful sisters. The machine had done its work. The image was exquisite. The cracks were invisible. Within 4 years, one sister would be sitting in Hitler's private box at the Berlin Olympics. Another would be marrying in the drawing room of Joseph Goebbels. A third would be running away to fight in Spain. The photograph was perfect. It was also the last moment that the image held. Chapter 4. The Fascist, the Beauty, and the Drawing Room in Berlin. Diana Mitford did not stumble into fascism. She walked toward it with her cobalt blue eyes wide open, and she chose it over a Guinness fortune. The meeting happened in 1932. Diana was 22. Oswald Mosley was 36. He was the leader of the newly formed British Union of Fascists, a man of extraordinary charisma, violent politics, and serial infidelity so prolific that even his admirers found it exhausting. He was also married. His wife, Cynthia Curzon, known as Simi, was the daughter of a former Viceroy of India. She was kind, loyal, and aware that her husband conducted affairs with the regularity of train timetables. Diana did not care. She later said that meeting Mosley was like being struck by a bolt. The attraction was immediate, total, and non-negotiable. Within weeks, she had begun an affair that would cost her everything the machine had given her: the Guinness fortune, her social position, her family's unity, and eventually her freedom. She left Brian Guinness. This requires pausing to understand what she left. Brian Guinness was gentle, devoted, wealthy beyond meaningful calculation, and the father of her 2 young sons. The Guinness family offered Diana a life of total material security and social prominence. She walked away from it without, by her own account, a moment of hesitation. The system that had manufactured Diana as the perfect society bride had no mechanism for what she did next. The machine could process a young woman's beauty into a marriage. It could not process a young woman's intelligence and ambition into a political ideology. Diana was not merely attracted to Moseley, she was attracted to power. She was attracted to the idea that the world could be remade. And because the system had given her no education, no profession, no legitimate channel for these impulses, she found an illegitimate one. Moseley's fascism was not a fringe curiosity in 1932. The British Union of Fascists attracted significant support from sections of the aristocracy and the press. The Daily Mail ran a headline in January 1934 that read, "Hurrah for the black shirts." Lord Rothermere, the newspaper's proprietor, personally endorsed Moseley's movement. The Anglo-German Fellowship, founded in 1935, counted peers, businessmen, and members of parliament among its membership. Fascism in the drawing rooms of the English upper classes was not shameful, it was fashionable. Diana moved through this world with the confidence of a woman who had always been told she was exceptional. She travelled to Germany. She met Hitler for the first time in 1935 at a rally in Nuremberg. She was dazzled. She later described him as having extraordinarily beautiful blue eyes. She returned to Germany repeatedly. She became part of his social circle. She used her beauty, her name, and her aristocratic connections as currency in a world where such things had real value. And then, on the 6th of October 1936, Diana married Oswald Moseley in a ceremony that remains one of the most extraordinary events in British social history. The wedding took place in the drawing room of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, at his home in Berlin. Diana wore pale gold. The guest list was small and deliberate. Hitler was not merely present, he was the guest of honour. He gave Diana a framed photograph of himself in an eagle-topped silver frame. An adjutant carried flowers through the park-like garden from the Reichskanzlei. The ceremony was conducted under German law. Moseley's first wife, Simi, had died 3 years earlier. He had also conducted an affair with her younger sister, Diana Guinness, being only the latest in a sequence of women that Moseley moved through with a consistency that suggested compulsion rather than passion. The wedding was kept secret. For 2 years, the British press did not know that one of the most famous women in England had married the leader of the British fascists in the home of a Nazi propaganda minister with Hitler as witness. Consider the image against the reality. The public Diana was still the beautiful society figure, the woman who had graced the covers of magazines, the ex-wife of a Guinness heir. The private Diana was standing in Goebbels' drawing room, accepting flowers sent by Hitler, pledging herself to a man who styled himself on Mussolini and would spend the war in prison. 2 days before Diana's wedding, on the 4th of October 1936, the Battle of Cable Street had erupted in London's East End. Moseley had planned to march his black shirts through a neighbourhood with a large Jewish population. An estimated 100,000 people turned out to block him. They built barricades from overturned lorries and paving stones. They fought running battles with police who were attempting to clear the route. The marchers were turned back. The streets were littered with broken glass and blood. 2 days later, in a drawing room in Berlin, Diana put on pale gold and married the man whose followers had tried to march through those streets. This is what the system produced. Not a monster, not a fool. A woman of genuine intelligence, devastating beauty, and absolute conviction who had been given no education, no profession, no legitimate outlet for her ambition, and who had therefore attached that ambition to the most dangerous political movement in European history. The machine made Diana Mitford. It polished her, displayed her, married her off to a fortune, and then watched, helpless, as she used every tool it had given her in the service of fascism. She was not the first aristocratic woman drawn to authoritarian power. She was simply the most beautiful, the most visible, and the most unrepentant. And she was not even the most extreme of the Mitford sisters, because while Diana was marrying in Berlin, her younger sister Unity was doing something far more dangerous. She was falling in love with Hitler himself. Chapter 5. The Girl Who Waited 10 Months for Hitler. Unity Valkyrie Mitford, conceived in a Canadian town called Swastika, ate lunch at the same Munich restaurant for 10 months until Adolf Hitler finally noticed her. The coincidences of Unity's life have the quality of fiction that no editor would accept. She was conceived in Swastika, Ontario, where her father had prospected for gold. Her middle name was Valkyrie. She was born in 1914, the year the old European order began to die. She grew up tall, blonde, blue-eyed, and with a temperament that her family described, with British understatement, as difficult. Unity was the middle sister, not the eldest like Nancy, who converted pain into wit. Not the beauty like Diana, who used her face as a passport. Not the rebel like Jessica, who had ideology. Unity was something more unsettling. She was an absolutist. She experienced emotions at maximum intensity and pursued obsessions with a single-mindedness that left no room for doubt, nuance, or retreat. She arrived in Munich in 1934 at the age of 20. Officially, she was there to learn German. In reality, she was there because she had become fascinated by National Socialism with a fervour that went beyond politics into something closer to religious ecstasy. She had attended her first Nuremberg rally and described it as the most wonderful experience of her life. She wanted to meet Hitler. Not as a diplomatic contact, not as a political ally. She wanted to be near him the way a pilgrim wants to be near a shrine. She learned that Hitler regularly lunched at the Osteria Bavaria, a restaurant on Schellingstrasse in Munich. So she went. She sat. She waited. She went back the next day, and the next, and the next. For 10 months, Unity Mitford sat in that restaurant, eating lunch, watching the door, and waiting for Hitler to speak to her. She positioned herself in his line of sight. She was tall, blonde, unmistakably English, and unmistakably aristocratic. She was also unmistakably staring. In February 1935, Hitler sent an adjutant to her table. She was invited to join him. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. Unity left the restaurant in a state that witnesses described as ecstatic. What followed was an intimacy that alarmed the British government, baffled Hitler's inner circle, and generated jealousy from Eva Braun that was documented in her private correspondence. Between 1935 and 1939, Unity met with Hitler roughly 140 times. She attended private dinners. She was given a private box at the 1936 Berlin Olympics. She received an engraved golden swastika badge, a personal gift from the Führer of a kind given to very few non-Germans. She was, by any reasonable measure, part of Hitler's social inner circle. Her diaries, discovered in 2024 in a cache of documents that had been hidden for decades, revealed the depth of the obsession. Entries about meetings with Hitler were marked in red ink. She referred to him as Angel in private correspondence. The handwriting grew larger and more agitated on the days she saw him. The days she did not see him were marked with visible disappointment. Unity used her access with enthusiasm. She wrote a letter to Der Stürmer, Julius Streicher's viciously anti-Semitic newspaper, praising its work and signing herself as a British fascist. She attended rallies. She was photographed at party events. She became known in Munich as the English girl who was always near Hitler, and she accepted, without apparent discomfort, an apartment in Munich that had been confiscated from a young Jewish couple. The couple, according to accounts that circulated for years, wept when they were forced to leave. Unity moved in. The scale of what one young woman accomplished through nothing but aristocratic entitlement and obsessive persistence is staggering. 10 months of daily waiting. 140 meetings with the dictator of Germany. 1 confiscated apartment. 1 golden badge. one box at the Olympics, one letter to the most anti-Semitic newspaper in the Reich, and one file at MY5 that grew thick enough that the head of British intelligence believed she warranted prosecution for high treason. The system had produced this: a baron's daughter, denied education, denied a profession, denied every legitimate channel for her intelligence and intensity, had used the only tools the system gave her: her name, her appearance, her social class, and her absolute refusal to be ignored. She had taken those tools to Munich and used them to gain access to the most dangerous man in Europe. The aristocratic machine had made Unity Mitford. It had given her a famous name that opened doors in Berlin. It had given her beauty that attracted attention. It had given her confidence that came from breeding rather than achievement. And it had given her absolutely nothing else. No education to teach her critical thinking, no profession to absorb her intensity, no framework for understanding that the man she worshipped was building the infrastructure for the murder of millions. Unity was not intelligent in the way Nancy was intelligent. She was not strategic in the way Diana was strategic. She was fervent. She was absolute. And she was, in the most literal sense, unequipped to understand the consequences of what she was doing. While Unity sat in her confiscated apartment and marked her diary in red ink, her younger sister was planning a very different kind of escape. Jessica Mitford was not going to Munich. She was going to Spain. Chapter 6. The Communist, the Destroyer, and the Roast Chicken, she refused. While her sisters dined with fascists, 19-year-old Jessica Mitford cashed her secret running away fund and eloped with a communist to fight in Spain. Jessica was the fifth daughter. She had watched her sisters enter the machine one by one and seen what it produced. Nancy had become a novelist, but also a woman consumed by private bitterness. Diana had become a fascist's wife. Unity had become a dictator's companion. Pamela had become invisible. Jessica looked at the menu of available futures and chose none of them. She had been political since adolescence. While Unity plastered her bedroom with swastikas, Jessica plastered hers with hammers and sickles. The two sisters shared a bedroom. The ideological boundary ran down the middle. This arrangement, which the family treated as an amusing eccentricity, was in fact a precise map of the European crisis unfolding beyond the Cotswolds. Two sisters, one room, fascism on one side, communism on the other, and a family that could not or would not see that this was not a game. Jessica's running away fund was a real account. She had saved money secretly, coin by coin, over years. She was waiting for the right moment and the right person. In 1937, she found both. Esmond Romilly was 18 years old, a nephew of Winston Churchill, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War and a committed communist. He had run away from school. He had published a seditious magazine. He had fought against Franco's forces in Spain and returned to England with a reputation as exactly the kind of young man that Lord Redesdale would chase with an entrenching tool. Jessica met Esmond, and the effect was immediate. Within weeks they had eloped. Their destination was Spain. The Spanish Civil War, which had begun in July 1936, had become the defining ideological battleground of the decade. Franco's nationalists, backed by Hitler and Mussolini, were fighting the Republican government, supported by the Soviet Union and by thousands of international volunteers who understood that Spain was where fascism would either be stopped or triumph. Jessica and Esmond arrived in Bilbao. They were 19 and 18. They intended to support the Republican cause. And when their families discovered where they had gone, the response was exactly what the aristocratic system produced when one of its daughters went off script. Lord Redesdale contacted the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office contacted the Admiralty. The Admiralty dispatched a Royal Navy destroyer to retrieve Jessica Mitford from Spain, a warship sent to collect a teenage girl who had run away with a communist. The captain of the destroyer was instructed to persuade Jessica to come home. He invited her aboard. He offered her roast chicken, chocolate cake, and the comforts of a Royal Navy vessel. Jessica refused. She was not going home. She was not going to be retrieved by the Empire's navy and returned to the nursery. The destroyer sailed back without her. That roast chicken is one of the great symbolic moments in the Mitford story. The Empire sent its navy. It sent roast chicken and chocolate cake. It sent the full weight of institutional authority to retrieve one disobedient daughter. And she said no. She stayed in Spain. She married Esmond, and she never went back to the life the system had planned for her. The price of refusal began immediately. Lord Redesdale effectively disowned her. The family fractured along political lines. Jessica and Esmond returned to England and chose to live in deliberate poverty in London's East End, as far from the Cotswolds as it was possible to be while remaining in the same country. They had nothing. They wanted nothing from the world they had left. And then came the loss that Jessica never recovered from. Their daughter Julia, born in 1937, died of measles at 5 months old. The death took place in circumstances that Jessica associated with poverty and inadequate medical care. She never spoke the child's name again, not in public, not in her memoirs. The name Julia became a silence in Jessica's vocabulary, a wound that she sealed and carried for the rest of her life. Esmond enlisted when war came. He joined the Royal Canadian Air Force because the regular British forces would not take a man with his political record quickly enough. On the 30th of November 1941, his bomber was lost over the North Sea. He was 23 years old. His body was never recovered. Jessica was a widow at 24. She was in America, where she and Esmond had emigrated, with a small daughter and no money and no family willing to help. The sister who had refused the destroyer, refused the roast chicken, refused the machine, was now alone in a foreign country with nothing but her convictions and her fury. By the late 1930s, before war made everything permanent, one family contained a fascist in Goebbels' drawing room, a fanatic in Hitler's inner circle, a communist widow in America, a satirist sharpening her pen in London, a countrywoman saying nothing in the countryside, and a teenager about to marry into a dukedom. One nursery, one governess, one linen cupboard under the stairs, and every political extreme the 20th century could produce. The machine had manufactured them all. It had given them beauty and breeding, and nothing else. And now the war was about to show what those choices actually cost. Chapter 7. A pistol in a Munich park. On the 3rd of September 1939, the day Britain declared war on Germany, Unity. Mitford walked into the Englischer Garten and shot herself with a pearl-handled pistol Hitler had given her. The pistol was small. It was engraved. It was a personal gift from the man she had worshipped for 5 years. And she turned it against herself because the two countries she loved, Britain and Germany, had gone to war, and she could not bear to exist in the space between them. The bullet entered her right temple. It lodged in her brain. It did not kill her. Unity was found on a bench in the park, bleeding and unconscious. She was taken to a Munich hospital. The doctors operated but could not remove the bullet without killing her. It remained inside her skull, pressing against the brain tissue, a piece of metal that would slowly, over 8 years, complete the work it had begun. Hitler was informed immediately. He visited her in the hospital. Albert Speer, his architect and later his Minister of Armaments, recorded the visit. Hitler was visibly shaken. He had been fond of Unity, not romantically according to most historians, but with a possessive affection for the young English aristocrat who had devoted herself so completely to his cause. Eva Braun had been jealous. Goebbels had been wary. But Hitler had enjoyed Unity's company, her absolute loyalty, her willingness to sit at his table and worship him without reservation. Now she lay in a hospital bed with a bullet in her brain, and the man who had given her the gun sent flowers. The arrangement to bring Unity home took months. She remained in Munich through the autumn of 1939, unconscious or barely conscious, while the war that had broken her began its first movements across Europe. Hitler personally arranged for her transport to Switzerland. She was moved by ambulance across a Germany that was mobilizing for total war to the Swiss border. It was a remarkable act of personal intervention. The leader of a nation at war devoted resources to evacuating a single foreign woman from his country. It says something about the relationship between Unity and the Nazi leadership that this was even possible. Deborah, the youngest Mitford, was dispatched to collect her sister from Bern. She was 19 years old. She had barely left England. She arrived in Switzerland expecting to find her sister injured but recognizable. What she found was something else entirely. Unity had huge eyes and matted hair that had not been touched since the bullet went through her skull. She was incontinent. She could barely speak. She did not fully understand what had happened to her or why she was in Switzerland. The golden-haired aristocrat who had sat in Hitler's private box at the Olympics was gone. In her place was a damaged, confused woman who would never recover. Deborah brought her home. The journey across wartime Europe, through France to the Channel, was a nightmare of logistics and grief. Unity arrived in England to a press frenzy. Photographers crowded the dock. The newspapers that had once celebrated the beautiful Mitford sisters now wanted photographs of the broken one. The family closed ranks. Lord Redesdale, who had sympathised with Germany throughout the 1930s, was shattered. Lady Redesdale took Unity to the island of Inchkenneth off the coast of Scotland, where she could be cared for away from the press and the public. The image against the reality. The public knew that Unity Mitford had shot herself in Munich. The press reported it with varying degrees of sympathy and condemnation. Some papers suggested she had been sent home pregnant by Hitler, a rumour that persisted for decades and was almost certainly untrue. What the public did not see was the daily reality of caring for a woman with a bullet in her brain. The incontinence, the confusion, the moments of clarity that were worse than the confusion because they allowed Unity to understand briefly what she had lost. The pearl-handled pistol, a gift from Hitler, turned against the woman who received it. It is the single most concentrated symbol in the entire Mitford story. The machine gave Unity nothing but her name and her beauty. She used them to get close to a dictator. The dictator gave her a gun. And the gun, in the end, was the only honest thing the relationship produced. While Unity lay in a hospital in Munich, the system was preparing to deal with another Mitford sister. This time the instrument would not be a bullet. It would be a prison cell. Chapter 8. The Sister Who Informed and the Prison That Followed. Nancy Mitford told MI5 that her own sister Diana was an extremely dangerous person, and the government believed her. The letter exists. It was discovered in declassified files decades after it was written. Nancy, the eldest sister, the novelist, the wit, the woman who converted everything into comedy, walked into MI5 and told British intelligence that her own sister should be considered a threat to national security. Was it patriotism? Nancy believed it was. Britain was at war. Diana was married to the leader of the British Union of Fascists. She had personal relationships with the highest-ranking members of the Nazi regime. She had been in communication with Hitler's inner circle as recently as 1939. Nancy told MI5 that Diana was not merely a fascist sympathiser, but a true believer. That she was clever and dangerous. That she should not be at liberty. Was it rivalry? Almost certainly. Nancy and Diana had competed since childhood. Diana's beauty had always been the currency that Nancy could not match. Nancy's wit was a weapon sharpened specifically because she did not have Diana's face. The relationship between them was intimate, complex, and laced with a resentment that decades of letters could not fully disguise. Was it retribution? Possibly. Nancy had suffered quietly for years. Her marriage to Peter Rodd was a disaster. Her attempt to have children had ended in an ectopic pregnancy that left her unable to conceive, a loss she carried with a public lightness that cost her dearly in private. Her novels brought recognition, but not wealth. She watched Diana attract attention, power, and devotion, and she watched with the specific fury of a woman who believed she deserved better and knew the system did not care. Whatever the motive, the consequence was absolute. On the 29th of May 1940, Diana Moseley was arrested under Defence Regulation 18B. This regulation, enacted at the outbreak of war, allowed the government to imprison anyone suspected of being a threat to national security without trial. There was no charge. There was no hearing. There was no opportunity for Diana to defend herself. She was simply taken. She was separated from her youngest child, Alexander, who was 11 weeks old. The baby was left with family. Diana was sent to Holloway Prison. She would remain there for 3 years. The conditions in Holloway were not designed for the wife of a fascist leader. They were designed for punishment. Diana slept on a plank bed. She was permitted limited visits. She was surrounded by women imprisoned for offences ranging from theft to prostitution to political activity. The society beauty who had been painted by the finest portrait artists in England was now washing in cold water in a cell. Moseley was arrested on the same day. He was sent to Brixton. After sustained lobbying, the couple were eventually permitted to live together in a house within the prison grounds, an arrangement that generated public outrage. To ordinary Britons enduring the Blitz, the idea that a fascist and his wife should be given comfortable accommodation while London burned was intolerable. The arrest destroyed Diana's social position permanently. Before the war, she had been controversial but still received. After Holloway, she was finished. The doors of English society, which had been flung open for the beautiful bride of Brian Guinness, were now permanently closed to the wife of Oswald Moseley. And the family itself was breaking apart. Lord and Lady Redesdale's marriage, strained for years by their daughter's choices, finally cracked. Lord Redesdale had initially sympathised with Hitler. The war cured him. Lady Redesdale did not change her views as quickly or as completely. The disagreement between them was not merely political. It was the accumulated weight of 6 daughters who had each, in their own way, demonstrated the failure of the system their parents represented. The marriage ended in permanent separation. They never reconciled. The scale of destruction was comprehensive. 1 informant letter to M5, 1 arrest without trial, 3 years in Holloway Prison, 1 11-week-old infant separated from his mother, 1 marriage between parents destroyed, 1 family scattered across continents and ideologies. And not one of them, not Nancy the informant, not Diana the prisoner, not Unity the invalid, not Jessica the exile, not Pamela the silent, not Deborah the youngest, could sit at the same table without the conversation becoming a war. Nancy's letter to M5 was the act that made the fractures permanent. It was the moment when the private rivalry of the nursery became entangled with the machinery of the state. The system that had manufactured these women now imprisoned one of them, and it was another Mitford who had provided the key. Nancy herself went on writing. She was working on the novel that would become her masterpiece. But before she could finish it, there was still the matter of Unity, the sister with the bullet in her brain. The sister who was still alive, still damaged, still carrying the metal souvenir of the day she tried to resolve an impossible conflict by destroying herself. Chapter 9. 8 years with a bullet in her brain. Unity. Mitford survived the gunshot, but the woman who came home to England was not the woman who had left. The bullet remained lodged in her brain. Surgeons had concluded that removing it would kill her. So it stayed. A small piece of metal pressing against the tissue that governed her speech, her movement, her continence, her ability to understand the world she had so catastrophically misjudged. The first years were managed on Inchkenneth, the small island off the Scottish coast where Lady Redesdale had taken refuge. Unity could walk, but unsteadily. She could speak, but with difficulty. Her personality, which had always been intense, became unpredictable. She had fits of rage. She had moments of childlike sweetness. She had periods of confusion in which the chronology of her life collapsed, and she could not distinguish between Munich and Scotland, between the Osteria Bavaria and her mother's kitchen. The woman who had attended 140 meetings with Hitler, who had been given a private box at the Olympics, who had written to Der Stürmer, who had lived in an apartment confiscated from a Jewish couple, was now unable to dress herself without assistance. By 1944, Unity weighed 13.5 stone. The medication, the inactivity, and the brain damage had transformed her physically. The tall, golden-haired girl, who had positioned herself in Hitler's line of sight, was unrecognizable. She was heavy, slow, and increasingly dependent on care that her mother provided, with a devotion that never wavered and a grief that never lessened. She died on the 28th of May, 1948. The cause was meningitis, triggered by the slow swelling of brain tissue around the bullet that had been lodged there for almost 9 years. She was 33 years old. She had spent nearly a quarter of her life as an invalid, and the entire second half of her 20s unable to live independently. The bullet had done what Unity herself could not. It had kept its promise. It just took almost a decade to finish. While Unity's body slowly surrendered to the metal inside her skull, her sisters were building, or rebuilding, or refusing to rebuild, the lives that the war had scattered. Diana and Moseley were released from Holloway in November 1943, officially on grounds of Moseley's poor health. The release provoked fury. Questions were asked in Parliament. Protests were held. The couple retreated first to the English countryside, then increasingly to France. Diana would spend the rest of her life in a kind of elegant exile, received by some, shunned by many, and utterly unrepentant about everything she had done. The social ostracism was total in certain circles and selective in others. Diana was too charming, too beautiful, too witty to be entirely excluded. She maintained friendships. She hosted dinners. She wrote with intelligence and style. But the doors that mattered, the doors of mainstream British social and political life, remained closed. She had married fascism in Goebbels' drawing room, and British society, for all its tolerance of eccentricity, could not forgive that. Jessica, meanwhile, was building a new life in America that bore no resemblance to the Cotswolds nursery. After Esmond's death, she had married Robert Treuhaft, a civil rights lawyer and fellow communist. They settled in Oakland, California. Jessica became a journalist. She became a muckraker. She investigated the American funeral industry and discovered a system of exploitation so comprehensive that her resulting book, The American Way of Death, published in 1963, became an instant classic and a genuine cultural event. Nancy channeled everything she had lost into fiction. The Pursuit of Love, published in 1945, performed a trick so extraordinary that its full implications took decades to understand. Nancy took her family, the fascism, the communism, the beauty, the bullet, the prison, the destroyer, the roast chicken, and she converted all of it into comedy. Beloved, gentle, English comedy. The novel sold massively. It made Nancy famous. It made the Mitfords, for many readers, charming. This was the final manipulation of the image. Nancy took the raw material of genuine political extremism, genuine tragedy, genuine moral catastrophe, and she laundered it through fiction into something the English reading public could consume with pleasure. The Radlett family of her novels were recognisably the Mitfords, but softened, made lovable, made safe. The fascism became eccentricity. The communism became youthful rebellion. The bullet in the brain became a plot point rather than a life. Unity was dead at 33. Diana was exiled. Jessica had not spoken to Diana in years and would not for decades more. Nancy was writing fiction because the truth was too heavy to carry in any other form. Pamela was tending her garden and saying nothing. And the younger sister, Deborah, the one who had collected Unity from Switzerland at 19 years old and seen the matted hair and the huge empty eyes, was about to face the crisis that would define her entirely. Chapter 10. The Duchess who bought her clothes at agricultural shows. When the 10th Duke of Devonshire died 3 months short of the tax deadline, Deborah inherited a house, a title, and a £7 million debt that should have destroyed her. The death happened in 1950. Andrew Cavendish, Deborah's husband, became the 11th Duke. He had never expected the title. His older brother Billy had been the heir, but Billy was killed in Belgium in 1944, 4 months after his wife Kathleen Kennedy had lost her brother Joseph. The war rearranged succession as casually as it rearranged borders. The 10th Duke's death triggered a tax event of catastrophic proportions. The estate duty rate in 1950 stood at 80%. The Chatsworth estate was valued at approximately £3 million. The resulting tax bill was £7 million, a number that exceeded the value of the estate itself because the assessment included works of art, rare books, and land at full market value. £7 million in 1950. To put that in perspective, it was enough to purchase approximately 2,300 houses at the average price of the time. It was a sum designed not to tax wealth, but to destroy it. The death duty system, introduced in 1894 and progressively increased through the 20th century, was specifically intended to dismantle the great aristocratic estates. And it was working. Deborah's response was the most Mitford thing any Mitford ever did, and it was the opposite of everything her sisters had chosen. She did not run to a political extreme. She did not seek proximity to power. She did not convert her pain into fiction. She did not choose silence. She went to work. The family sold tens of thousands of acres. They transferred Hardwicke Hall, the Elizabethan masterpiece, to the National Trust. They sold works of art. They sold rare books. They stripped the estate to its bones to meet the debt. The process took 17 years. The final payment was made in 1967, and then Deborah rebuilt. She opened Chatsworth to the public and personally managed the operation. She sat in the ticket office. She oversaw the catering. She established the Chatsworth Farm Shop, which grew to employ over 100 people. She created Chatsworth Estate Trading, a commercial operation that turned the house and its grounds into a sustainable business. She bought her own clothes at agricultural shows because she understood that the money she saved was the money that kept a roof on a house that contained one of the finest art collections in private hands. The scale of what she accomplished defies the narrative her family had created. 80% death duty, £7 million owed, tens of thousands of acres sold. One Elizabethan house surrendered to the nation, 17 years of payments. And by the time of the 12th Duke, a fortune estimated at £910 million and a £32.7 million restoration programme that returned Chatsworth to a condition it had not enjoyed in a century. Deborah was the sister the system actually needed. Practical, unsentimental, brilliant with logistics. And she had been the one the system noticed least. The machine that made debutantes had looked at Deborah, the youngest, the least dramatic, the one who talked to ponies and kept her opinions to herself, and it had dismissed her. She was not a beauty like Diana, not a wit like Nancy, not a fanatic like Unity, not a rebel like Jessica. She was just the one who saved the house. And in doing so, she answered the question that the nursery had posed to all 6 of them. What do you do when the system gives you nothing? Deborah's answer was the quietest and the most devastating. You do the work. Chapter 11. The Ones Who Built and the Ones Who Burned. Nancy Mitford died in her Paris apartment in 1973, her back destroyed by Hodgkin's disease and her heart broken by a man who never loved her enough. The man was Gaston Pulowski. He was a French politician, a confidant of de Gaulle, a man of charm and cultivation, and a romantic commitment that fell catastrophically short of what Nancy needed. She loved him for decades. She moved to Paris to be near him. She wrote novels about love that millions of readers consumed as comedy and that were, beneath the wit, precise transcriptions of her own heartbreak. When Pulowski married another woman, Nancy absorbed the blow with the only tool she had. She made it funny, to everyone except herself. Her literary legacy was substantial. The pursuit of love and love in a cold climate remain in print, read, adapted and beloved. Her biographies of Madame de Pompadour, Louis XIV and Frederick the Great were international bestsellers. Her essay on you and non-you language, distinguishing upper class from middle class English vocabulary, became a cultural phenomenon. She was one of the most successful English writers of the mid-20th century. But the private ledger was devastating. No children, no lasting romantic partnership, years of excruciating pain from Hodgkin's lymphoma, which was misdiagnosed for years. She died in her apartment on the Rue d'Artois, surrounded by the beautiful French objects she had collected, attended by friends, and still fundamentally alone. Jessica's trajectory was the mirror image. She had lost everything early: her family, her country, her first husband, her first child. And from that total loss, she built a career that would have been remarkable for anyone, let alone a woman with no formal education from a Cotswolds nursery. The American Way of Death, published in 1963, investigated the American funeral industry with a precision and fury that transformed public understanding of how the dead were exploited. It was an instant bestseller. It prompted congressional hearings. It changed industry practices. Jessica Mitford, the girl who had refused the roast chicken on a Royal Navy destroyer, had become one of America's great investigative journalists. Hons and Rebels, her memoir published in 1960, remains the sharpest, funniest, most devastating account of aristocratic childhood ever written. It is the book that made the Mitford story accessible to ordinary readers, and it is the reason that the Hons cupboard entered the vocabulary of anyone who has ever studied the English upper classes. Diana outlived nearly everyone. She survived Mosley, who died in 1980. She survived to 93. In 2002, in one of her final public statements, she said that she regretted nothing. Cobalt-eyed and silver-tongued to the end, she refused to apologise for the drawing room in Berlin, for the friendship with Hitler, for the years in Holloway, for any of it. She maintained that Mosley had been right, that fascism had been misunderstood, and that the war had been an unnecessary tragedy. She was wrong. She was magnificently, articulately, charmingly wrong, and the system that made her never required her to be right. It only required her to be beautiful, and in that it succeeded completely. Pamela, the invisible sister, lived quietly and died quietly in 2004. She had spent her life tending animals, managing a farm, and maintaining a long companionship with Giuditta Tomasi, a horsewoman that the family acknowledged but the press of the era did not examine. Pamela's silence was its own rebellion. In a family where every sister was defined by the volume of her choices, Pamela chose to make no noise at all. It was perhaps the most subversive act of all. Chapter 12. The question the nursery still asks. Deborah, Duchess of Devonshire, died on the 24th of September 2014, the last survivor of the most extraordinary sisterhood in English history. She was 94. She had outlived all 5 of her sisters. She had overseen the transformation of Chatsworth from a bankrupt estate into one of the most visited stately homes in England, receiving hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. She had written books about her chickens, her garden, and her life with a directness and warmth that made her, in old age, a national treasure. When Deborah died, something closed. The last living connection to that nursery, to the Ons cupboard, to the governess, and the library, and the cold bedrooms, and the father who chased visitors with a military entrenching tool. The last woman who had sat in that linen cupboard under the stairs and argued about the future with sisters who would become a fascist, a communist, a journalist, a satirist, and a silence. The evidence of their lives remains. Chatsworth still receives its hundreds of thousands of visitors. Nancy's novels are still in print, still read, still adapted for television. Jessica's journalism is still cited. Unity's diaries, discovered in 2024, still have the power to shock. The red ink and the word angel, and the obsessive cataloguing of meetings with a man who would murder millions. The Mitfords. Letters Between 6 Sisters, published in 2007, remains one of the most extraordinary archives of family correspondence in the English language. 6 voices spanning 8 decades of love, fury, comedy, and irreconcilable difference. The 2025 television drama Outrageous prompted yet another wave of public reassessment, another generation asking the same questions about these women. But the deeper question is the one that the nursery still poses, and it is the question that implicates not just the Mitford family, but the entire system that produced them. The same nursery, the same governess, the same linen cupboard, the same parents, the same denial of education, the same expectation of decorative silence, the same machine that processed young women into wives and asked nothing of their minds. And from that one set of conditions, 6 completely different women. The Mitford story reveals something that the aristocratic system never wanted to admit. Privilege does not insulate against extremism. It enables it. When you take 6 intelligent women and deny them education, deny them autonomy, deny them a voice, you do not produce obedience. You produce the full spectrum of 20th century radicalism. A fascist and a communist, a duchess and a journalist, a satirist and a silence. Every possible answer to the question the system refused to ask: what do these women actually want? The machine that made the Mitford sisters is not an artifact. The system that assesses women by beauty and bloodline and compliance, that offers them display instead of education, that measures their worth by their willingness to be decorative, did not die with the debutante balls. It changed its clothes. It updated its vocabulary. It moved from the ballroom to the boardroom to the screen, but the mechanism remains. Take a woman's intelligence, starve it of legitimate channels, and then act surprised when it finds illegitimate ones. Every woman who was told to be beautiful instead of brilliant. Every woman who was handed a script she could not bear to read. Every woman who was displayed in a photograph and valued for the composition rather than the mind behind the smile. Every woman who found that the only way to be heard was to be extreme, because the system had made ordinary impossible. The Mitfords were not aberrations. They were the system's natural product. The gilded cage does not create conformity. It creates the conditions for radical, dangerous, and sometimes magnificent escape. 6 sisters, 1 cupboard under the stairs, and a question that has never been answered because the machine that manufactured it is still running.